Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our session, Flexible Working, Hype or Reality. We hope you find this session useful. As usual, it's a pretty fast run through some of the issues that are circulating at the moment in relation to hybrid and flexible working. We will be recording and we'll circulate a session after the event. As you will be familiar with now, if you've got any questions for us, please use the Q&A function throughout the presentation, and we're going to do our very best to leave some time at the end to answer any questions that you might have. So we promise we didn't know anything about Omicron when we decided we were going to run this session. What we were thinking about was just how different things have become in the last 2 years and the impact that the whole concept of flexibility and hybrid working, how much of a difference it has made to the way we think about work. Office workers needing to be physically in the workplace is becoming outdated. There's just no way around that. It's just a reality. And those of us who didn't grow up in that era will be still clinging to the idea that being physically together makes for a better working experience. And there may be still, of course, there's some truth in that, but the reality is that workers, particularly younger workers, don't really see it that way. I was watching a documentary last night about WeWork, which is that tech company in the States that went bust, that set up all those communal working spaces. And one of the factors in that was the fact that actually this idea of communal working actually ran its ground. People didn't really want to be as communal as WeWork had a vision for. So, at the end of the day, employees are starting to change the way they think about work. They've been remarkably adaptable, incredibly compliant during the pandemic. But in that time, expectations, ambitions, connection to the workplace has changed, and we need to recognize that. And I suppose the question for us is management a step behind? If we are, we need to prepare for the future and get a step ahead. And that's really one of the things we want to kind of address in this session. So what are we going to cover? One of the most commonly asked questions from clients is, what are employers actually doing? So you're all asking each other, are you really doing this? Or is hybrid working a reality? So Lynn's going to talk a bit about that. We're going to talk a little bit together about the sort of practical issues when it comes to implementing a hybrid working model. We're going to talk a bit about contracts and policies, flexible working and flexible working requests, and then really finish up with the challenges of managing what's called a distributed workforce, particularly focused on diversity and inclusion. So I'm just going to hand over to Lynn, and she's going to talk about what employers are actually doing to the extent that we know.
Okay, thanks, Joan. So what we're seeing employers adopt quite a lot of different approaches, but you're going to be familiar with them all. They all kind of do what they say on the tin. So some employers are adopting the office first approach, which is kind of what it says. So that's where you've got employers really bringing people back or proposing to people back into premises, workplaces, offices, whatever that might be. They're still planning to have some home working like they might have done pre-pandemic, so it can still be done on an occasional basis, but the primary place of work is going to be in a physical workplace. Then we're seeing remote first. So that's where employers are adopting long-term policies where really you've got home working or working from some other location as the default. So similarly, they're not necessarily giving up all their premises. There might still be some locations or hubs that people can go to collaborate, but you're going to have processes and systems which are, as Joan mentioned, the distributed workforce. They're going to be geared towards that. And then, of course, we've got hybrid working, which is this combination of people working between home and an office. We didn't know about Omicron, as Joan said, when we started off this week thinking about this webinar, but it's here with us. So whatever approach that employers are going to take, it's going to have to be adaptable because we're going to keep getting these new variants emerging all the time. But what do we think is currently the most popular? Well, you can see from the slide that the hybrid working appears to pretty much be the runaway favourite. This is a slide that we've taken from Hubble HQ, which is a property search company. And what they've done is they've gathered up data from some of the larger employers in the UK. and in terms of what they're actually doing. So you can see from this slide on the left-hand side, we've got some employers adopting this office first approach. You might remember the chief exec of Goldman Sachs, David Solomon, who very famously said something about home working being an aberration and this not being the new normal. And Goldman Sachs certainly have been quite aggressive in terms of getting people back into offices. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, we see some employers adopting the remote first. So in the UK, Deloitte, for example, are basically saying to all 16,000 of their UK staff that they can just permanently work from home. So we've got these two extremes, and then in the middle, we've got hybrid working, obviously. And there seems to be two kinds of hybrid working going on. We've got some hybrid working where a policy or a strategy is being adopted whereby there's a policy whereby you're expected to come into the office maybe 2 or 3 days a week, and the rest of the time can be spent at home. So we see some organisations, I think KPMG are doing this, where they have a 4-day fortnight, so you're expected to come into the office 2 days every week. To me, that sounded like they were only going to have to work 4 days in a fortnight, but apparently not. It means you go into the office 2 days on each week. Or what we sometimes are seeing separately is a hybrid policy, which is pretty much you can work wherever you want, and you can work from that location whenever you want to work from that location. So places like Nationwide are doing that with their staff. And actually very recently, you might have seen in the news yesterday, Virgin Money announced its post-pandemic workforce strategy, and it's proposing to do a similar thing. So amongst lots of other flexibility for its staff, what it's proposing to do is that for those members of staff who aren't in front-facing roles, they'll be locationless. They'll be able to work from really wherever they want. And there are lots of employers that are adopting that approach. So what we're really expecting to see, I guess, is that there will be a bit of a combination, because a lot of workforces have categories of staff. You will have some staff that just have to be physically in a workplace because they'll be client-facing, customer-facing, and you'll have others that aren't in roles like that. So what we're probably expecting to see is a bit of a combination. So some employers might have some categories of staff in office first, and you'll have other staff who are able to work either hybrid or indeed actually completely remotely altogether. So I guess what we're seeing is a lot of this hybrid working is being borne out by the researchers. It's following the research that's being done. I mentioned the Virgin Money Future of Work survey that was published yesterday. The survey itself was done earlier in the year and was a survey of their own staff, but also of around 3,000 members of the public. And interestingly, what that showed is that there were 74% of respondents, all of whom feel that having the ability to work from a geographical location other than a physical workplace would be beneficial for them. And that's kind of replicated in all the other research that we're seeing coming through. So there's CIPD research, which tends to suggest that 40% of the employers surveyed said that they expect more than half of their workforce to work regularly from home after the pandemic has ended. Whenever that might be, that figure might have changed. And before the pandemic, we had 65% of employers either didn't regularly offer working from home, or they only offered it to a very small proportion of their workforce. And after the pandemic, or as we're going through the pandemic, that number has fallen. So only 37% of employers now are either not offering home working or don't expect to offer it. And similarly, in the Ernst & Young Work Reimagined survey, similar sort of trend, 9 in 10 employees wanting flexibility in where and when they work, 40% wanting flexibility in where they work, so 2 or 3 days maybe remotely. And interestingly, also a lot of information or stats coming through about when people work. So people don't just want to work from home, they want to be able to work at times that suit them. They want to be able to work less. So, you know, we're seeing trends towards, are we going to have a 4-day week and all those sorts of things as well. So really what we're seeing from all the surveys and stats is that there really is a cultural shift in how people are going to be working, and hybrid in particular is really not hype. We think it really is reality, and it's something that is going to continue. There's a lot of good reasons for that. It's not really unsurprising, because There are a lot of advantages of hybrid working. I'm not going to go through all of the bullet points on the slides, but you can pick out just a few of them. Improve staff well-being. You hear lots of reports of staff saying that their general mental well-being, their physical well-being, their work-life balance, their general happiness is improved by not having to go through stressful commutes, by being able to juggle things at home as well. Lots of people who have caring responsibilities, for example, are finding it much easier to do that when they're able to work from home, work remotely, than obviously when they're having to physically go into office spaces. And that hopefully will drive actually better inclusivity. We'll come on to talk a little bit about that again later on in our presentation. But allowing that greater flexibility does allow greater ability to juggle. It allows people, for example, with disabilities, perhaps to more actively participate in the workforce. And it's also helping with skills retention. And so we're seeing statistics as well, which are suggesting that 50% of employees are looking for jobs or more likely to take a job if there is flexibility attached to it. And the flip side of that, I guess, is that if lots of employers are offering flexibility, they will be lured away from employers who don't offer flexibility. So being able to offer that to your workforce is going to be something which hopefully will allow you to retain staff, and of course also being able to attract people from a much broader geographical pool from anywhere across the UK. So that's just pulling out some of the advantages. There are lots of other ones there as well. But of course, like anything, it doesn't come entirely without its issues. There are some practical considerations to think about with hybrid models, particularly where half of that is obviously going to include people working from home. And I know that all of you will have been working through what is now probably a very well thumbed or ticked checklist of things that you have to go through when you're thinking about having people working from home. Joan's going to pick up on some of those, including the contract versus having a policy point. But I know that you'll all have been thinking about how do we ensure people's health and safety while they're working from home? How do we protect our data if people are starting to collect lots of information that's sitting in their houses? How do we actually deal with things like regulatory requirements? We know there's now guidance from some regulators like the FCA about what you need to do in order to ensure that you're still meeting all your regulatory obligations while people are sitting working from home. So lots and lots of these things everyone's had to get to grips with very quickly. There is a good checklist of all these issues for any of you on the webinar who are Workbox subscribers. You can go on there and you'll find the checklist of all the sorts of issues that you need to think about. But of course, there are lots of layers of other things which are now becoming, I think, bigger issues or key issues for HR professionals. And I'm going to hand back to Joan to pick up on some of those.
Yeah, so one of the things we're thinking about here really is this hybrid model, because I think we've got quite relatively comfortable with all of the issues that happen or that we have to think about in relation to home working. But when we've got that sort of balance between sometimes working from home and sometimes working from the office, there's another layer of things to think about, and particularly when you've got this flexibility that you want to deploy on, well, both sides want to deploy, frankly. I've divided them up into sort of two. These are the big themes, I think, and they're divided into two categories: the management side of things and the legal side of things. We don't have time to go spend a lot of time talking about the management side of things, but I think the one thing I would say to you is that this concept of command and control management, which sometimes is underlying this idea where you've got workforces and managers who are saying, I need people back in the office because I can't get enough out of them when they're at home, or I can't manage. Sometimes that's down to the question of whether or not they as managers are well enough equipped to handle the challenges of managing a distributed workforce. But the command and control thing is genuinely becoming outdated. So we have to rethink communication in terms of how you divide it between those who are in the office, those who are out of the office, and the fluid movement between the two. Culture is a big issue. You see a lot of HR people talking about how you create and maintain a culture when you haven't got that proximity anymore, or you may have proximity with some but not with others. And then we've also got just the whole question of how you distribute and manage resources between those who work at home and those who are going into the office. So those are all sort of big issues to tackle. From a legal perspective, we thought the things to talk about today very quickly were contract changes and policy development, the future of flexible working requests and equality and inclusion. So I'm just going to cover the first two just now. So contracts and policies. If at the minute, I think most employers have operated on the basis that we're there's a bit of goodwill. We haven't really formalized the flexibility. A lot of employers have not formalized the flexibility yet. Some employers hoping that they'll just go back to normal. And that's, I think, what our message is, you probably won't. But if you do want to maintain a balance, it's quite difficult, and will be quite difficult in some circumstances, to give employees a complete choice, because if people are customer facing, for instance, as Lynn said, it's very difficult to allow them complete flexibility. So notwithstanding people's wish for that, you're going to have to do something which meets both their expectations and the expectations of your business and the needs of the business. In the short term, as I said, I think lots of employers are hanging on to this idea that, you know, it's still, everything's still abnormal. So resisting requests for anything that nails down current home working or flexible working arrangements. There is a bit of that going on. So just an attempt to say, you know, the world is still fluid. Things are still unknown, uncertain, as we all know from the weekend. And you're gonna have to bear with us, and we don't want to sort of nail it down. However, there are organizations who've just decided, as you saw from Lynn's original slide, to plump for one or the other or a combination, and they will need to look at contract change and policy development. Yes, you can, you know, formally change the contract, have a reservation of a right to change. Probably the preference would be retaining flexibility using a policy. So that's one of the things that's on Workbox at the moment, our online platform, where we've got a policy which effectively you use to supplement the contract and set the parameters for the way in which flexibility will be operated. So you have to find a balance. You have to, if you're going to, like in the same way that if you're exercising discretion as an employer, you want to draw the boundaries around where that discretion will be exercised or how it will be exercised in relation to flexibility, particularly where it's a two-way street, you want to retain the boundaries. So big question, do you set geographic limits so that people can't live particularly far away from the office so that they can be called in when they're needed? Are you going to set out the reasons why you need people to come into the office? Are you going to write that out longhand, having made a decision yourselves about when it will be important to have people in? Do you need to review? We've still got clients who are paying travel allowances to employees who aren't traveling anymore. Do you need to strip those out? Have you got benefits or policies that have some connection to a base location? So if you've got a redundancy policy, for instance, on selection, do you need to think about whether or not people, how you take into account changing locations through that? So those are all things that, there is no one size fits all. Everybody's policy will be different. But what you should probably be doing at the moment is thinking ahead. Flexible working requests, if at the moment you've got somebody who's insisting on this and they want it tied down, and there will be people who will want it tied down and you can't resist that, people have the right, as we know, to make this application. And really all I'm going to say about this is that the reasons for refusal at the moment have to fit into the criteria that are listed on the screen. And what we think is the ones in red, so detrimental impact on quality, detrimental impact on performance, and detrimental effect on ability to meet customer demand. If you've had somebody who's been at home for the last 2 years perfectly successfully with no deterioration in quality or performance or customer demand, I think you might find that those are difficult to rely on. Probably the most popular one at the moment for a formal request will be planned structural changes, just relying again on this idea that we're living in a world that's too fluid and that we may in the future need to make things different, and giving that as the formal reason for refusal if that's what you want to do. That's kind of where we are. Well, there is obviously a government consultation pending on flexible working, which looks like it may extend the right to all workers. It's being billed as a sort of a default, some kind of, you'll automatically get it. That's highly unlikely to be the case. It's not, as a bit of a misinterpretation of the direction of travel, because obviously it would be impossible for all employers to grant optimum flexibility to everybody who asks for it. So that's a watch this space on that subject. So Lynn, I'm going to hand over to Lynn. She's going to cover off the subject which I think you probably all know has been covered a lot, which is diversity and inclusion.
Okay, yeah, so I did say earlier that one of the advantages of hybrid working was the positive impact that it might have on inclusivity, but that's not a given. And organisations, we think, are going to really have to give this some thought. So we're all going to have to be very mindful of proximity bias and insider-outsider groups. And I'm sure that's something that has been entering into your consciousness a lot more as we've gone through the pandemic. Proximity bias is something that describes the phenomenon of unconsciously looking more favourably on those that we work most closely with or that are beside us. And in the workplace, that obviously tends to mean that employees who work in close physical proximity to each other and to managers are often perceived as being better workers. They end up with that kind of halo effect around them. If the manager can basically see and they can hear what the employees round about them are actually doing, they may be more likely to allocate work to them. They might be more likely to give them sort of juicy projects that come up. They might basically value their skills. It's simply old-fashioned favoritism in a way. But of course, what happens when that if that arises is that there can be a detrimental impact on those who are in the out group. And what we're obviously seeing is that the out groups are likely to be going forward people in the categories that are highlighted on the slides. So women who still bear the burden really of caring responsibilities, and there's been quite a lot of research that's been done throughout the pandemic that emphasises that. So women are 8 times more likely to be the primary carer of children, and through the pandemic what we're hearing is that domestic burden actually seems to be increasing. I don't know if we all not everybody might not agree with that, but I think when we talked about this at our own team meeting, Joan and I put our hands up to say, yep, we think that has indeed happened. Disabled workers, about 1.3 times more likely to work remotely than non-disabled employees. Obviously a huge advantage. They can probably arrange their work spaces in a way that suits them, that meets their particular needs. Ethnic minorities is quite an interesting one. During the pandemic, you'll probably have been aware, just watching the news, that people from Black ethnic minorities were amongst the highest rates of diagnosis of COVID-19, but there are also Black and Asian minorities are twice as likely to die from COVID than white British people. So it's not, I suppose, unsurprising that people from those ethnic minorities might be more likely to favour working from home and might continue working from home either permanently on a more regular basis once we get through this pandemic, whenever that might be. And younger workers as well, I suppose they might be quite subject to some sort of detriment if they're not in the workplace, because they're just not going to get access to the same kind of work, the same kind of experience, the same kind of stretch opportunities. And indeed, there seems to be a bit of suggestion actually, and you hear this borne out a bit anecdotally, that in some organisations it's the younger people, in fact, that sometimes are going into the office, and if it happens that way round, they're not getting exposure to management who are staying at home, and they're I don't know if this is quite the right way of putting it, but almost running amok and not really learning from anyone. So there could be quite a detriment on all of these groups of people, and the risks of that, of course, is that we might start to see a rolling back or losing some of the gains that have been made in the context of diversity inclusion, which would be a really unfortunate thing. And I think it would be remiss of me as an employment lawyer not at least to also mention that it does give rise to the risk of discrimination claims materialising and being successful as well. So it's something really that we do want to be thinking about. There are various things that could be done to try and mitigate against those risks materialising. And I've got a bit of a starter for 10 on the slide. I'm sure that you will all have more ideas or will be starting to think about this yourselves. But leading by example as a starting point. So managers and leaders actually working to the hybrid model themselves. It's that sort of old saying of you can't be what you can't see, that sort of thing. So managers will have to get into this as well and work in the same way as their teams are working. Think about adjusting practices. So at the moment, and I think we've had some experience of this in our own team as well, of trying to hold meetings where we've got some people physically in a room and some people remotely. It is a difficult thing to do because naturally people just gravitate to the conversation is dominated by those that are physically together in a room. So you've really got to think about ways of being able to include people who are joining virtually. Otherwise, they're just going to be excluded. Their voices aren't going to be heard. And that means that you're probably going to have to think about having somebody who really is in control of that meeting. You know, your traditional chairperson who has an agenda but can actually watch out and make sure that everybody's voice is being heard. Or indeed, I suppose one of the suggestions is have everybody join virtually. So you might have some people sitting physically in an office, you might have some people at home, but just get everybody to join virtually, and then you're all in the same playing field, so to speak. Thinking about how work is allocated is also another good tip. There is a real tendency to just pass the work to the person who is physically in close proximity to you. So people who are managing or are delegating work might just pass it to the person that's in the office beside them without really giving much thought to any sort of system for doing that. So are you really giving it to the best person for the job? Does that person need the experience? Is there somebody sitting at home who would actually welcome that work to develop themselves, maybe progress in their career? I think we're going to have to just be a lot more mindful of those sorts of things. You might just end up also with staff in offices being completely overburdened if they're being given all the work, and you've got some people sitting at home who might not be at capacity. Making sure that managers are trained. I think all employers have been doing a really sterling job through the pandemic of making sure that managers are more attuned to identifying signs of mental ill health and stress and all the rest of it. We don't want that to lapse. If we end up in a hybrid model with people physically in a workplace where you can see them, you have to remember that those working at home still need to speak to you. So you're going to have, managers are going to have to remember that they are still going to have to build in quality time to have those conversations with people who are at home or some other location, and also physically in the office as well. And they're also going to have to, I think, just be more attuned to looking at output and not time spent in the office. There's been a sort of real tendency of presenteeism in the past of, I suppose, people being viewed as better employees if they're just sitting in the office longer or for more time. It's going to become more important, I think, to focus on output and think about how you're actually assessing people's performance. I've put on the slide promoting networks. Lots of employers have obviously good established employee networks, women's networks, and the like, those sorts of things. Using those to consult on key issues like working practices, I think, could be a really useful way of using those networks. You might be able to get feedback from them about how communication is working for people who are working from home or not in the office, how it is impacting on things like promotion, career progression, and actually monitoring what is happening in your organisation. So once you've had hybrid working perhaps in operation for some time, what are you seeing? What are you seeing in terms of recruitment and people leaving and career advancement and promotion and people having opportunities? Are there any gaps? And if so, why is that? Why is that happening? And once you've identified it, then obviously you can start to take steps to address it. So that's some of the starter for 10. As I say, I'm sure some of you, please share them in the Q&A box if you've got other good top tips for promoting inclusivity in a hybrid model. But that's all that we were going to say. And I think there are some questions. I don't know if you've been viewing them, Joan.
Yeah, so we've got, I think we've probably answered are organisations formally changing contracts for employees? That's one question. I think the answer is we think not yet, unless they've done as some of the employers on Lynn's first slide have done, which is actually commit. For us, I think our experience has been the vast majority of employers are not yet taking that step. When it comes to the next question, is an interesting one from Andy Patterson. Andy, I know where this is coming from. This business about locationless and whether or not you can allow people to work from abroad, and the implications of that. I think when this first started to happen, if you remember, lots of people went home during COVID, and they went to Spain and Portugal and Germany, wherever, and were working from home, and then they wanted to continue working from home. And I think initially, particularly smaller employers would held their hands up and said, oh, no, you can't possibly do that. And we know that some very big employers actually said, absolutely not, we're not doing it. We're starting to see the larger employers adopt a policy. Lynn and I were talking about this earlier. I think, for instance, for the universities, where they might have the resources to handle the advice needed on the implications of allowing someone to work abroad. We do have there is actually a blog on the website that covers all of the issues that arise in this context. Obviously not jurisdiction by jurisdiction, because the problem for us is that every jurisdiction is different, but you know, the key headlines that you need to take account of. What's the direction of travel on that? I think, interestingly, we're probably seeing more of it being allowed. We sort of went, yes, everyone's doing it, it's necessary. Oh no, this is really too complicated, let's get everybody back. And now we're back to, we're probably seeing more requests now again for longer term relocation and locationless policies. So that's probably the best answer I can give you on that.
Yeah, we can attach the blog actually to the slides that we send out after the webinar, so we can do that, which might help with that particular question. And the other thing I think people are quite interested around is the default consultation on flexible working being the default, because I think that has led mistakenly to a lot of people thinking that there will no longer have to be a request to work flexibly, and it's just something that everybody is entitled to. And of course that's not the case. We don't know, of course, when that's going to end up coming through, because it's going to be dealt with when there's parliamentary time, which might be never. So who knows when that will actually happen. But looks like there's going to be some developments in the field of flexible working as well.
One other question very quickly, just advice about formal requests when you've actually got lots of people making the same request, or lots of people, you know, competing interests. I think, we know this is an issue. If you go back to that list of reasons for refusal of flexible working requests, one of the reasons you can use to refuse is that the inability to manage that amongst existing staff. Some employers have a first come first serve sort of approach to it, and other employers will say, well, you know, if particular people have sort of preferential rights to flexibility, if they've got protected status, that where that might have an impact. But it's difficult to. Your point, Rachel, is how do we ensure in fairness to all? But that is quite a tricky thing to do, and you can see options or possibilities of favouritism opening up.
Okay.
Got another question there, so I can't really see. I don't think the disabled statistics are accurate, as despite disability legislation, very few employers offer the flexibility to allow those with transport or pain issues to work full-time effectively. This new working could promote more people in the workplace. Care should be taken not to offer preferential treatment, such as those using with childcare. Yeah, I think it's a similar theme. This question is about the what we call the competing interests, where you've got protected people with protected characteristics, and you've got to try and sort of balance the fairness between a number of people with protected characteristics. That is tricky. It's just you know.
I think the suggestion often is that you have to think about who might be without a job actually if you can't make the adjustment. For example, a disabled person, would they end up not having a job at all because they just wouldn't be able to work? But it's really tricky. You've got to come up almost with a set of principles of just managing the risk, isn't it? And thinking about how you manage these competing requests in a way that avoids or discrimination as far as you possibly can.
Yeah, indeed. Okay.
I think that is us at the end. So thank you very much for everybody for joining our session today. What you will see as you log off is a little pop-up screen asking you to fill out or answer some questions, and we'd be really, really grateful if you could do that for us. I promise you it only takes a minute, or I'm assured it only takes a minute, and there are only 5 short questions, and it really does help us to shape our future webinar programs, to think about topics that will be useful for you to do. So if you're able to do that, we'd be really grateful. And thanks again for joining us today.